welcome to Reality 2.0, the podcast. I am Katherine Druckman with Doc Searls, as always. And
hey there.
Joining
That's my new
us
last name, as always.
As always, is Doc Searls. Everyone's favorite. You can tag that on. It's a little, anyway. And we have Kyle Rankin, who, if you've been listening to our podcast, you know Kyle. We love Kyle.
Ahoy, hoy. I love you.
Yeah. We wanted to talk to Kyle again because we like talking to Kyle and we don't really need an excuse. But today we're going to talk about mobile devices, and the most personal of all devices is also potentially the one that is the most threatening, I guess, to our security and privacy. And you know, we've discussed privately and now with you how it seems like every day I'm reading something more and more, unsettling, some terrible exploit, that makes my data on whatever platform I'm using, iOS, Android, anything, but makes it vulnerable. Just recently, there was news that came out about a government-subsidized phone for low-income families that came pre-installed with malware. There's articles about hacking into people's SD cards, which a lot of Android phones use for additional storage. Articles about duplicating people's fingerprints so that you can hack into their biometric protection. So it's it's at the same time it's the device that most people have and most people trust with their personal data, but it's also not just lacking security, it is also giving up your location, giving up everything there is to know about your life, to the point that again, speaking of articles, the New York Times came out recently with an article describing how they could easily, just based on location data, pick out a person's identity just from the places that they visited, because it's a fingerprint. Your movement is your fingerprint. So anyway, I will hand it over to y'all to sort of take that discussion a little bit further.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start by talking very abstractly about the phone as a computer platform, and sort of why it's such a big deal, that it's why it's such a great platform to abuse people's privacy, maybe, because it's not, to some level, a lot of the things that we're seeing aren't new. If you have an old desktop computer or a laptop, web browsers are constantly trying to get store information and metadata about the sites you visit and all of that. That level is something that we've been dealing with for a long time. And in addition to pre-installed malware, there were a long time ago, one of the first things that a lot of us would do if we got a laptop for our family and it wasn't running Linux, and for example, say they even didn't want to run Linux, they wanted to run Windows, was to reinstall it from Windows from scratch, because it always came with all of these pre-bundled weird applications from the vendor, not even for Microsoft, but from the vendor, that in many cases turned out to be spyware. So you take all of that, which is also equally true on a modern phone, but add in the fact that, in addition to all of the things that your regular computer can do, which is, your personal computer that you are with in your house or with it in your work, you have this pocket computer that is with you everywhere you go. And add to that, in addition to all of the regular things that regular computers can do, your pocket computer has all of these extra great sensors in it, and so they have a GPS, they have ambient light sensors, they have accelerometers so they can detect motion, and it's something that's in your pocket all of the time. So, and it has a cellular modem that's always connecting and triangulating with towers, because the towers need to know where you are so they can direct a phone call to the right tower. So that's always going. If you have Wi-Fi on and you're walking around, it's behind the scenes attempting to look for valid access points. So it's attempting to associate. And so you can gauge in many ways. If you were the kind of company that had metadata stores of all of the wireless access points that you could drive by with a car and their signal strengths, you could easily correlate that with the Wi-Fi access points that a phone goes by and get a pretty decent sense of where somebody is. So it's all of the privacy concerns with their desktop computer and all of the privacy threats just magnified because there's all of these extra sensors. So regardless of platform, just to start with, just the fact that it's the most personal phone in your pocket that has all of your personal information on it makes it just this great platform for abuse.
Yeah, I actually just had that conversation with a friend yesterday about how, as people who make websites and whatnot, how at some point in our life we realize just how much even just a web browser gives up about the user. I mean, it is almost a fingerprint. All you have to know is the version of every piece of software that a person is using, the version of the browser, the version of the operating system, the IP address. There's so much just given up by your web browser. So, add that to this other treasure trove of data that a phone provides, and it would be really hard to stay anonymous.
Well, the thing is that with, here in the physical world where we are all separately, but connected digitally. But here in the physical world, if I look around my office, I see a zillion details. All of them are really good tells about all kinds of things. If I look in the mirror, there are all these tells that are really fine details about my face. If I look at where I've been in the world, which I remember, all of those things could be used to fingerprint me one way or another. But a grace of human existence is that we're forgetting all of this. What we know is tacit, it's not explicit. And that's part of human living as well, that we, the three of us would recognize each other in a crowd, but we'd have a hard time explaining exactly how we do that. It isn't just eye color, it's all kinds of implications that we pick up, and the human brain is really good at understanding without being really good at explaining. And unfortunately, computing things are really good at the explicits, and there's no tacit whatsoever. So you can add, even with AI, AI doesn't do tacit, it just does more explicit with more implications of explicit. So it adds up all these explicit things that, oh, by the way, it also doesn't forget. It can correlate a zillion different ways. And we can be known so many ways and so well. That is just mind-boggling. But the fact that most of the science behind this has been used mostly just to sell us crap it's actually been like a false read. It's been a big misdirection. It's like, well, we're not worried. I haven't really been, okay, I'm followed by Google or Amazon, which wants to sell me a headphone or a speaker. So what? I don't care. No harm, no foul. But the innocence or the incompetence or the irrelevance of all of that lulls us into a kind of complacency. And we've done just a horrible job of understanding what, not only, I think we've always understood what the risks are. I know the geeks have, but we haven't gone to the trouble of saying, for example, our browser ought to be like a car. Not like a modern car, which does have spyware in it, but an old-fashioned car where it's my car. It's a carapace that I carry around that I ride in and doesn't have any spyware in it. And I have a sense that it's a private thing. And, it's my castle on wheels. My home is my castle, right? Whoever said that, I forget who. Oh, Blackstone in the UK said that. But we don't have our homes as castles. Instead, we've got our homes online are just lined with eyeballs, like the eyes of a fly is a zillion eyes looking out. It's kind of the opposite of that. There are a zillion eyes looking in. And that's bad. This is inherently bad. But I don't even know where we get it, unless we're using, and we should transition into this, unless we have an inherently private device to use in the first place and zero base on that, we're not going to get it.
Well, that's a good segue.
Kyle.
So just getting it out of the way. So we want to make sure that for anyone who doesn't know who Kyle Rankin is, and then I ask who are those people, but and why are you listening still?
All five of them.
No, everybody knows Kyle. So Kyle works for a company called Purism that has come out with a new phone. So Kyle has a arguably biased perspective on all of this, but at the same time, Kyle is the person I would trust most with my personal security. There's that endorsement. But I think for that reason, I think, Kyle, you have an encyclopedic knowledge about cell phone security. I mean, that's what you do, right? So I think that you are well qualified to have this conversation. So to that end, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you are addressing, security and privacy issues with your phone.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for all the compliments. I don't know if I agree with all of the superlatives, but thank you anyway. But I will try my best. I'll try my best to live up to some of that. So it's good to get out of the way that I have a biased perspective because I work for a company that's trying to solve this problem. And whenever you hear an opinion from someone who's selling a product trying to solve a problem, there's an inherent bias. As much as you try to get rid of it, it's baked in there. But all that to say, this problem that we're talking about with phones in general was the problem that caused Todd to found Purism many years ago, because he saw this same problem in the context of his children. We have this on the website. There's this whole origin story about why Purism was created to begin with. And it essentially comes down to, he has two daughters, and they were getting old enough that he was starting to think, in a certain number of years, they're going to want a phone. And he didn't feel comfortable giving them any of the phones on the market because of all of these reasons we just stated. He didn't feel safe with them in their possession. And then he realized, wait, I have all of the skills necessary to solve this problem, or to create a business to solve this problem. But I can't start with the phone. I need to build, credibility in the market and show that we can deliver things by doing a laptop first, and then moved on. Fast forward now, we're now in the final phase of that initial plan, where we now have a phone that we're completing and starting to ship out to backers. Right now, we're in the initial phases of that. So I have one of the earlier batches of this phone, and it was designed with all of the things that we're just talking about in mind. And a lot of that has to do with just it running a regular Linux operating system instead of Android or iOS, and then having all of these other, there's a lot of problems with how phones have been designed the last handful of years, because in many ways they're looked at, especially on the Android side, less so on the iOS side, just because the marketing is different about that. But there's a focus, in a way of monetizing the user, and that's baked into the design of the phone. So an example you mentioned at the very beginning of the show about the story about these government issued phones that had spyware installed on them. Well, the problem and the difference between, say the Android platform and getting spyware baked into an old Windows machine that you bought from your vendor is that the spyware, you couldn't uninstall it. It was impossible to uninstall because there's mechanisms within Android that allow Google to make, Google apps uninstallable. And so I imagine there's probably some way that you can, through some clever routing of the device, perhaps be able to trick it to remove software. But if you were to go into the regular means to install software and uninstall software, all of this malware that's pre-installed, you can't do anything about. You're just sort of stuck with it, right? And that's in many ways by design, because there's some basic applications that Google doesn't want you to remove from Android, like Google Apps, because that's their critical, as some people would say, maybe parts of it are spyware. But that's, besides being, in their opinion, critical to the device, it's also a means of which to gather data from people, So like our focus with creating a phone was to create one focused on sort of respecting the user, or giving the user power over the device and ownership over the device and their data, because as we said, this is like an incredibly personal device. You have it on you all the time. It has sensors listening all the time. And most people, the way that the phones are designed nowadays, you get one. You can get updates as long as the vendor decides you're allowed to, which is usually 2 to 3 years maybe. Then after that, it just sort of magically expires and you can no longer get updates. And there's a lot of, it's almost as though you're renting it. Like I saw a story recently about when there were the trade wars between China and the US, Google was ordered by the U.S. government to remove Huawei's ability to get updates from Google, and they were able to do it. It's one thing that placed the order, but the shocking thing to me was that, yeah, the mechanisms are in place where they can say, yeah, you're not allowed. We can restrict all of your devices that you have in your possession from getting these updates. And we saw the same thing with Apple too, when there's a lot of controversy when they were really starting to push the privacy narrative as part of their marketing. And their main competitors, Google and Facebook, they were able to use that as like a differentiator, right? And so they started looking into permission settings that Facebook had and Google had on certain applications. And when they saw that they were pulling more data than they should, then they made a big show of removing those applications from iPhones remotely, right? And so some people saw that and they said, well, that's, very responsible of Apple and well done and all of that. And I said, that's frightening.
At the same time, they just removed software from your personal device. Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of that old classic Kindle story where they removed 1984 from everyone who bought it. It's just like you couldn't make that up.
Or conversely, the U2 album. Remember years ago when YouTube came out with an album and it just magically appeared on everybody's Apple device and people freaked out. They're like, I didn't put this here. I didn't order it. I didn't sign up for it. You just pushed it out. Like, what the hell is this? It's kind of the same thing.
Well, yeah, there's this perception that you don't necessarily own these devices completely, right? I mean, there's this paternalistic approach from the vendor where we are here to take care of you, the user. You don't really necessarily know what you're doing, and so we have to protect you from yourself. But don't worry, we're here to save the day, and just turn everything over to us, and we'll make it okay, right? Despite the fact that a lot of this is based, in my opinion, off of very the way that IT looked at users using computers 20 years ago when people weren't necessarily digital natives. But now you have, despite what some people would say, I would argue that people are way more sophisticated about using computers now than they were 20, 30 years ago. Yet the ability of a user to control their own device is way less now than it was 20, 30 years ago. A lot of workspaces and a lot of just even personal devices are incredibly locked down with keys that the vendor controls, which is just really strange considering how sophisticated and knowledgeable about computers people are now.
Yeah.
And the excuse on their part is, and I hear this on the user side as well, is that, okay, the world we have is so completely bad that this is the only way. The only way is, okay, as long as half of you are using iPhones or whatever Google's excuse is, we have to operate this way. We're in charge. Sorry. I know you'd rather be independent and all that, but it's not like that anymore. We're not. We're running we're running a railroad here. You don't have a car. You're a passenger on our system, and it only feels like it's yours, and we want you to feel like it's yours, but it isn't really. It's ours, and you're just using it, and you're paying for the rights to use it. But basically, we've got the system, and it's locked down. That's not an excuse, by the way. I'm just trying to explain what I've heard. What I've heard of their logic.
Oh yeah, no, I mean that's the approach. The approach is, we're the only way to make this safe is for us to fully control all of the keys. If you were to ask most security professionals, even a lot of experts in the space, to design a system to secure a device or to secure software, they almost universally invent a system where coincidentally their vendor has full control over keys. They will implement some kind of key signing mechanism. These days they will add some sort of hardware component to further lock it down and make it difficult to root, and the keys will be fully controlled by the vendor. That coincidentally also requires you to put 100% full trust in the vendor, and it also means that your only options are to be secure and fully rely on them, or have no security. In many cases, you have to turn it all off. So it's an all or nothing kind of proposition, which is not necessarily how I like to approach security anyway. I tend to liken it to golf, where I like to say, I use this analogy a lot, but a lot of people approach security in the security space, security experts, as though they are playing golf and they get to the tee and their only goal is to hit a hole in one. And they swing and they look, and did they get a hole in one? No. Well, then they quit. That's it. The only goal is to get a hole in one. where in my mind, security is a game of getting closer to the hole with every stroke. And you don't throw away a stroke just because it got closer to the hole but didn't go in. The goal is to, as with every procedure or every method you put in place, that you're a little bit more secure, that you're slowly incrementing toward being secure. So that influences all of the security decisions that we make at Purism, for instance. It's a weird problem that a lot of people in the security space don't have to face, because our problem is to give someone security while also keeping control in their hands, which is a way harder problem to solve. It's a lot easier to solve the problem by saying, just give me all of your keys, I'll take care of everything for you. But we want to, and so it influences a lot of our decisions. It influenced how we handled boot security on our laptops, and it also influenced a lot of the decisions about how we handle the phone too. Not just security, but just overall design, because the thought is someone should own this device. They should feel like it's their device. And so what some of the challenges we hit in making it, and our CTO, Nicole Ferber, wrote this great blog post a couple of weeks ago about, I think it's called Breaking Ground. And it talks about all the challenges in making this phone, because essentially we had to make it from scratch. The entire ecosystem was built around certain off-the-shelf components that, as long as you bought those off-the-shelf components, you were fine. But the problem is they were all very closed, and they were all built for an Android ecosystem. If you wanted to run free software on them, and especially if you wanted to have as free of firmware as you could get, they really didn't have a whole lot of options for you. Also, if you wanted to have the ability for the user to replace certain parts, we've seen this with laptops the last, decade or two. The focus on laptops is thinness above all else. Some people really want a thin laptop. I don't necessarily care one way or the other, but I would argue that the drive to make laptops thinner as a differentiator has ruined, in many cases, a lot of laptops, because what you end up with is, there's no Ethernet ports anymore, which would be kind of handy. You just end up with like one port maybe for a big dongle adapter in many cases. It's caused, in many cases, RAM to be soldered onto the board. A lot of components to be baked into the board and not user replaceable,
right?
Including the battery, right? All in the drive just to be thin, which I'm sure some people asked for, but a lot of people didn't necessarily until they were told that was the differentiator. And the same thing goes for phones. It's worse in phones because that's been a huge driver to make phones as thin as humanly possible, which is why you can generally not replace the battery anymore. And you certainly can't replace a lot of the other components. And in many cases, you can't add a micro SD card anymore, although there's exceptions, of course. But because of all of that, when we had to essentially build this from scratch, because a lot of the things that we wanted someone to be able to do with the phone didn't really exist anymore. We wanted someone to be able to remove the modem if they wanted to either swap modems or didn't want a modem. Or in our case, we wanted people to be able to turn the modem off with a switch that actually, cut the circuit and shut it down, which, that's an odd request. So,
yeah. So go ahead. Sorry.
No, that was it. Go ahead.
Well, so back in our Linux journal days, we had, and I'm trying to remember the names of some of them, but there were a bunch of Linux phones. And all of them failed. Now, I think to some degree what happened was that both iPhone and Android came along, and with the App Store, so a user install was real easy. And I'm wondering how Purism is going to be, and how the Purism phone is going to be different that way, especially for adding apps. Is it basically a really great little computer, or is it something that has easy app install and a likely market that's going to grow in the app space on the phone?
Sure. Well, I'll sort of answer in two different ways. One, there's two different topics that I really want to talk about. One is sort of the history of Linux phones and why it felt like it died maybe 5 years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago, a little bit. And then to the App Store. We'll do the App Store first. So to me, Linux has forever had solved like had an app store way before anyone knew what an app store was. You know, if you remember,
Mm.
I mean, go back 20 years ago, and you give someone a computer and you tell them to install an application. If you weren't running Linux, what you would do is you would go to the website for the software that you wanted to install. You would go to that site and download an exe, or maybe you would go to, you know, downloads.com or something like that. You download the exe and run it. And if you wanted updates, every application either had its own built-in update mechanism, or you would go to the site and download it. And then the OS was completely different. And this is in the age of the online world. We're skipping past, you know, what all of us remember with CD-ROMs and floppies. But anyway, in that world where you could go download EXEs, Linux for the longest time had an application store where at first it was command line, but then there's been GUIs wrapped around it where you just search for the applications you want, and it's all through one big pane of glass, as it were, and you download and install it. In our case, we're handling in the same way. So we have all of the applications. Right now on this phone, if I can run the same GNOME software program that you would run on a Pure OS desktop because it's running the same OS. I can run that and see the same list of applications available to install. Now, the big challenge, and this is something where we've had to do a lot of work in-house to fix this, is that almost all of the applications were written assuming you're running them on a landscape mode computer with a large screen, right? And so what you find is if you take any program on your desktop and then drag the corner of the window to be really small, the size of a phone, and usually it gets to a certain size after which you can't shrink it further, right? But we also have this history now that people have been browsing the web on phones. You also notice that if you do the same thing on a web browser, a lot of times, especially if you load the mobile version of a website, there's a whole thing about they call it responsive design, where the idea is to make the web app, you know, if you shrink it down, it works, right? So essentially, we're working on a similar, in-house, we've published a library called LibHandy that's been integrated into the GTK libraries that you use to build GUI applications that makes it easy for you to do the same kind of thing for an existing application. So you can say, when you drag the corner of the app, essentially, and it gets to a certain size, it says, oh, I need to go to phone mode. And the widgets and everything automatically move to where they're supposed to be to look good on a phone. So for the applications that don't necessarily support that, then that's where you start. Right now, what we're seeing, like if on the phone that I have, I will install an application, and if it has been updated to take that into account, then the widgets look good and things work well. If it hasn't, then I have a window where a lot of the stuff runs off the screen, right? However, I've only had this phone for a week, but one of the applications that was like that is called Gpotter. And that's like a long-standing, pretty old now podcast application, just a nice GUI application to add podcasts like this one and start listening to, and subscribe to feeds and download and listen to them. Well, it ran off the screen, but not too much, but it did a little bit. But because it's Linux and because this was a Python GTK application, I was able to go through and I just sort of poked through the code. And of course, I'm not really a big Python programmer at all. And I've done a little bit of GTK programming back in the day, but not very much. But I was able to poke through the files that the package installed and find the one that described how the window was drawn. And I essentially made a 2-line change and it works perfectly on the phone, where the 2-line change told these two different sort of windows within the window that were stacked horizontally, so side by side. I just told them to go stack top to bottom. And once I did that, then it fit perfectly in my phone screen. And a lot of some applications will be more complicated than that, but that's an example of that one. It was a pretty simple change and it worked fine on the screen. So that's sort of the app store issue for us is more a combination of web apps, which is how Apple initially wanted to solve the problem. And then in addition to that, all of the existing applications that you have available on any Linux desktop, making sure that the prime time ones, the best ones of those, work on the form factor of the screen. But for the history of Linux phones, I tell you, it's really interesting because what this current Librem 5 reminds me of is my previous Linux phone, which was a Nokia N900. I actually did a review of that for Linux Journal. And it was
Very
just
popular.
it was such a cool phone because it was like, why it was cool was it was like having a Linux desktop in your pocket. Yep. It was real Linux. You would actually install Debian packages that all worked, and it had this huge community of developers, and it was going to be the big major Linux phone platform. So what happened? Well, ultimately Nokia was bought out by Microsoft. And because Microsoft had aspirations of doing its own phone OS, and essentially shut all of that stuff down. And so parts of it lived on. Some of the developers went on to try to resurrect the software side of it. But if you had a hardware, Nokia, a hardware company working on an OS as well, then you have all the combinations. You need to have the right recipe, successful phone. Since after that happened, there was a lot of attempts to do something else for the community to try to make something else. But my theory on why a lot of it failed, at least, is that a lot of the people who were working on it viewed it as a software problem and not a hardware problem. And so what they said was, well, because they were all software companies, so that was their wheelhouse. So they said, well, we're either an OS company or we're software developers. All we need, it's as easy as, they thought, to get just some random hardware somewhere, some pre-existing hardware that already exists, and we just have to port our OS to it, and it'll be fine. It's the same sort of mentality that a lot of people have approached with Linux on the desktop. They said, well, all we need to do is, we will win as long as someone can install Linux, buy a Windows computer and install Linux on it, then that's all we really need to succeed. And as we've seen the last, couple of decades, that's not the case. I think one of the main reasons that Linux didn't take off on the desktop like it should have was because there weren't very many options to get it pre-installed. Most people have never installed Windows or Mac OS either. They buy a machine and it's supported with whatever OS it comes with. And for me, the phone isn't really no different. If you want something to succeed, you have to approach it as a hardware company with hardware that has the software pre-installed and ready to go. It has to be convenient that way. A lot of people, if you say, well, all you have to do is go buy this rooted device somewhere, go through these odd steps to root it further, and then run our OS installation script, and then you're good. Some people will do that, but not as many as you would need to get mass adoption.
Interesting. I came across we had my household, I say we had an N900 back in the day, and I was cleaning and found an old N900, and it's kind of shocking how different a device a modern smartphone is from the N900, but not necessarily in a good way, So
right. Well, yeah, there's all these design decisions that largely were dictated by iPhone design, right? Just the same thing with laptops. Laptops became thinner, partially because Ultrabooks allowed it to be so, but largely because Apple used it as a differentiator for their laptops. They said, we're 3 centimeters thinner than this other laptop or whatever. Or that's too large, but it got down to ultimately millimeters. But anyway, same thing happened with phones. They said, well, before that, remember, the BlackBerry was the dominant player. And they said, no, keyboards are lame, everybody. You have to do a touchscreen keyboard. And instantly the entire market moved over. They add a notch, everyone adds a notch. Whether you ask for a notch or not, everyone just sort of taking design cues from them. And the same thing goes, like the N900, it had an actual pretty nice fold out, nice little
really
keyboard.
Nice keyboard. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was very usable. I used it for all kinds of stuff. But, modern day, that's not really popular. And so your main options are touchscreen, I guess.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about just device security? I think that's something that I don't know. I don't know how much people actively worry about it, but maybe should. I don't know. I feel like I see so much out there that's just like literally every day. Or somebody will email me something, or I'll see something every day about how my device is going to screw me in some way. Right. It's going to happen. and there's this line about how, well, you need the latest phone. You've got to upgrade your phone every year, or else you're not secure, you're in danger, or you have to. And that kind of mentality I resent. I mean, I shouldn't have to spend $1,000 a year just to be secure, to have a secure phone. And there's a lot of, I don't know, probably misinformation out there. And I wondered if you could sort of go over just like, what are the biggest security vulnerabilities? Like, for example, we talked about, how a lot of phones, in the interest of size, don't have expandable storage anymore. But what about the people still using the old ones that have it? Is that less secure? Or just old devices in general? I don't know. I wondered if you could just kind of touch on what the major security vulnerabilities on people's phones are.
Yeah, I would say the first thing is that, and this is more applies to Android, because with iPhones, there's been more of an attempt to support older devices. Mm-hmm. But with Android devices, because the market has been so fragmented for so long, it's been really difficult to get vendors, because what vendors end up doing is they take the base Android, they fork it, and anyone who's forked the code base knows that the further you deviate, the harder it is to bring it back in line. So what ends up happening is they fork a code base, they do a lot of custom changes, and then when Android upstream announces a big update, they have to speculation, is it worth incorporating backporting these changes into our fork or not? And so what you end up having now, because at one point they just decided, no, it's not really worth it. And they wouldn't really, in some cases, you couldn't even count on the next version of Android when it comes out working on a phone that you bought from a lot of vendors. Eventually, there was enough outcry about this that you started seeing people offering updates for a certain amount of time. They would say you'll get software updates for the next 2 years or something, maybe 3 years, because they want you on a 1 to 2 year cycle anyway. They give you a software updates for a small amount of time. But yeah, so to me, the biggest security issue is that if you aren't willing to pay for a new phone every 2 years, then you're faced with potentially with an Android OS that doesn't get updates anymore after a certain amount of time. I mean, even I have like I currently have a Google Nexus device, which was Google's attempt to solve this problem by saying, we will just ship a bare bones Android with our apps on it, and we promise, a certain number of years of updates from the moment that it ships, which was great. But those of us who are past that point, I'm past that point on this phone, and I can't get OS updates anymore. Because they don't support it anymore. So then at that point, even though the phone works perfectly fine, it's not like it's too slow to run the apps that's already running or anything like that. But now if I care about security, I have to now get rid of it and get a new device, or optionally root it, which Google would say is even less secure, and then run a third-party OS from one of the community Android alternatives that does get newer updates, as long as my device is supported. And that's the other thing, is there's so many Android devices out there, mm-hmm. that it's always a moving target, because communities can only support so much hardware. They only have so much hardware on hand. I mean, we've seen this on the Linux desktop. When someone would ask me, 5, 6, 7 years ago, before I worked at Purism, so now I'm biased. But if someone were to ask me, what laptop should I get? Now I'm biased, so I would just tell them to buy a Purism laptop, I guess. But before that, I would say, well, if you want to know how, I would pick a laptop that you see a lot of Linux developers around you using, because it's mm-hmm. more likely that things work, especially if there's a laptop that a lot of kernel developers are using, then you know that the kernel support's probably pretty decent on it, because if there's a problem, they will work to fix it. And the same thing kind of goes for phones, because there's not an unlimited size of the community that can port to every piece of hardware. So there's limits, and so you end up with hardware compatibility lists. And if you get a flagship phone from a vendor, there's a decent chance that after a couple of years, after it's a couple of years old, it might finally start getting support. Just like 20 years ago, if you bought a brand new Linux computer or a brand new desktop computer, you usually had to wait a year or two before Linux ran well on it, because people hadn't written drivers for everything. And the phone landscape is pretty similar.
So in practical terms, what does that mean? What can, like, okay, I have a 2-3-year-old Android phone. What can somebody do to me? A malicious actor.
Well, you're not getting OS. Yeah, so your apps in theory should still get updated. So if you're worried about, there's two big vectors. There's a fundamental OS issue. That hasn't been patched. That if someone takes advantage of it now, they could have malware that persists on your phone always, and you're not aware of it anymore because they essentially kind of root your phone.
Right.
So there's that threat. On the app side, generally speaking, you should be able to continue to get apps for a good long time. Apps generally, they'll support a range of Android OS versions, so you should be able to keep getting updates along those lines for that part. So that part, as long as you're good about always keeping things up to date, I mean, it's really just a game of always updating your Android device.
Sure.
And if you have the latest version, then you're probably okay.
But I mean, can people read my files? Can they? I don't know. There's my banking info compromised. Like, what exactly is compromised? Just to put it in complete layman's terms.
Well, sure. So in complete layman's terms, in theory, if you have a 3-year-old device that had an unpatched major vulnerability in it that you couldn't get patched necessarily, then someone who could convince you to install an application, like a modified malware version of an application, could then have remote access to everything on there.
Yeah, anything. So your device is their device, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah. If you put a file, your pictures, all that stuff. I mean, we've seen that, right? People get remote control of someone's phone, and
famous people.
All the famous people and all their nudes are now on the internet, right? I mean, that's a thing that really happens. And usually it's a case of convincing them to install some application that looks legit. But there's also cases that, there have been many cases in the past of exploits that work remotely. You can send someone an SMS, a certain type of SMS, and get remote control. Now those things get patched, but again, if you're running an old device, then you may not be able to get that patched, and that's the problem. There's just so many of these old, and so so for those people, the alternative is you basically just need, if you want to stick with Android, you have to budget for getting a new Android device, however often your vendor provides updates, essentially.
I'm wondering, great. Yeah, I'm wondering about the larger ecosystem or trying to influence that. And the one I'm thinking of right now is in cars. So as it happens, where I am here in California, our car died last year, and we didn't get another one. We just rent cars, and so I rent a lot of cars, and most of them, not all of them, have what's called Apple's CarPlay and Android something. I forget what the Android one is called. They usually maybe just called Android Play or something like that. But what it means is that if you plug your phone into the USB jack of the car, or if you associate it with, you connect it through Bluetooth, all of a sudden your navigation app shows up on the display in the car, and the display in the car basically turns into a big replica or something like a replica. They're all clunky, but something like one of your phone. And these are, I hate to say it, are really handy, especially for navigation. It's a lot easier to look at the built-in display on your dashboard than it is to look at the phone laying on the seat next to you or some other thing like that. And I'm wondering, I mean, all of these car places all the car makers they're moving in they've always been kind of proprietary. They're making it worse on the whole. But I'm wondering if there's some ways to put holes in the bowling ball that is the car makers and twist them in the direction of opening things up to something like this phone, or open and free phones. Do you see any hope in that direction?
I mean, in some cases, I mean, what you're seeing, the reason that they have the Android Auto and the iPhone, sync up with those phones is because they were trying to, at one point they decided, they were trying to have an in-house OS that did all of that. And they were always running behind whatever the latest state of the phone is. And people would say, I just want what's on my phone to be on that screen. And so, you would get a brand new car And it's the same problem with the phone. You get a phone, and your average Android phone starts showing its age after getting updates for a while. And a car is even worse because it's not really going to be getting over-the-air updates a lot. And so, 10 years on, that interface is going to look pretty clunky. And so, yeah, their solution to that is, well, we will just support. Also, the other problem is people, iPhone people would want it to be like an iPhone, and Android people would want it to be like Android and have that compatibility. So the solution was to have their in-car system support both of those protocols, so they didn't have to worry about it. They just had basic support, and you just plug in your phone and get anything else. There has been, there in the embedded space, there's a lot of Linux, and the car embedded space there is too. And I've heard from time to time there's been different projects to do that, and it's possible that some of those in-car infotainment systems you see are Linux-based.
I would assume so. That's one reason I thought it might make some kind of sense.
But they certainly don't open that up, right? I mean, famously, the Tesla systems are Linux under the hood. They're running a custom Linux OS for sure. But yeah, they all will have an interest in making it proprietary, or making it, they're not going to necessarily publish the source code for all of their changes.
Yeah, boy, I sure love to change that, but that may be just the wrong one to push. Go ahead, sorry.
You could hear the argument. I was going to say, you could hear the argument of, well, but it's your car. Imagine if you were to change it from our lockdown protected thing, and it gets hacked, and then someone somehow remotely controls your car. Of course, you could argue, well, people, if you go to DEF CON any year since,
and
the last couple of years, someone's doing that already, right? And so is it really any different? But yeah, the argument would be, no, we have to close this. We have to close all of this up because otherwise someone could hack your car. Well, that would at least be what they would say. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. The car is an even tougher problem than the phone, because you're talking about hardware that truly doesn't change, and the existing phone OSs really aren't necessarily made for longevity, because they want you to, because there's a built-in sort of feedback loop between the phone vendors and the cellular providers to keep everyone on a tight 1 to 2 year upgrade loop. And it benefits both parties, and so they both kind of, even whether it's intentional or not, there's these design decisions and other decisions that are all based on that idea that you're going to upgrade your phone every 2 years or so.
It's pretty bad.
Weird.
If you take a car from 1995, and it's not in 1995, a 1985 car wasn't that old.
Right.
Right now, a 2016 car feels a bit old. That's
well, and the funny thing when it comes to computers and phones, and this is something I ended up writing this really long-winded blog post about the Librem 5 a couple of weeks ago about obsolescence and how we're trying to fight that as part of the design, because this is a problem, especially in the phone space, that upgrade cycle of every 2 years. But it's weird because the hardware, generally speaking, is still fine. It's just the OS doesn't get updates for the most part, or because the apps are accustomed to getting new hardware every 2 years, they're not trying to improve or optimize the applications. Generally, they know they're going to get more CPU. But it reminded me of, again, the Linux desktop space, where you would get this computer. I remember forever our Linux users group would get these computers that were deemed too old to use to run Windows on. They're so slow, and then you would put Linux on it, and it was like a brand new computer. It was just way faster. And even though the hardware was old, and if you go to a Linux conference nowadays, you will see people with 10, 15, sometimes year-old computers that are still running fine for the most part. Now, sometimes websites in particular are getting pretty crazy as far as resources, but a 10-year-old laptop isn't you'll see a lot of people with 10-year-old ThinkPads running fine. Like right now, my personal Librem laptop is 6 years old, just about. And before that, I had my previous ThinkPad for 6 years. And I only upgraded really because I thought the Librem 13 was really cool. And my ThinkPad was starting to get a little slower with websites. And to me, the phone could be the same way. There's no, in our case, because we haven't even really gotten started on the optimization side too. I mean, we're optimizing to a point, but a lot of it's still working on getting, hardware drivers working well and things like that. That it's one of these cases where, the phone today has a certain speed and then it runs it runs fine. But in a year from now, it'll be actually a lot faster because people haven't focused on optimization. In the year after that, it'll probably be faster than that. And it should improve over time. And because we have no interest in shutting down updates, like we said, we're going to provide updates for the life of the device, then it should get better because, and again, this goes to the fact that we're a hardware company, that, we have this one hardware platform we're supporting with the OS. And so we can make sure that the software that we're writing works well with the hardware we're providing. And that's something that's why I think some of the other attempts have failed to a point, is that because they didn't have a background in hardware, it was difficult to, you're either faced with trying to source a device and maybe support it, and then you don't have all of the supply chain requirements nailed down to get the phones that you need, or you're trying to support a ton of phones and you're always chasing the next one. But in our case, like I said, we can standardize on one platform and just make sure it works and optimize for it. So in my case, I'm expecting to have this phone for I don't know how many years, but quite like substantially longer than I would a regular Android phone, just because I know it will continue to get updates.
I do like that approach. I was looking at your website earlier, and I noted the approach of getting better with age, which is something that I think is missing.
And at the very least, it shouldn't get. There's no reason for it to get slower. I mean,
right.
If anything, sometimes you might have someone wrote a web application that's really a hog or something. But other than that, there's not really any reason it should get worse with age, other than someone who's being kind of sloppy about how they write an application.
Right.
And also because things are replaceable. The other thing that usually causes people to throw away their phone is the battery, right? So the battery dies. You either can go to a shop and have them try to replace it for you, or you're out of luck, or you get a new phone. And batteries just don't last forever. They can't. You can recharge them a certain number of times and they die. And because of the drive for thinness, a lot of manufacturers made it really hard to change the batteries. But that's one of the other things. Like, we made a point. One of the reasons our phone is significantly thicker than some of the brand new super thin phones is because we had to allow space for you to remove the battery, remove the modem, and remove the Wi-Fi card with actual slots like you would see in a laptop.
But is it a significant difference, really? I mean, you're carrying it around at this, and I realize that your perspective is biased. But seriously, how much are we talking about in terms of thickness? I
mean, when you look at it, what it looks like is it's thinner than the N900 that you have.
Well, yeah.
So you can use that as a guide. But so it's thinner than that. But no, if you compare it to a regular phone, what it looks like is a phone where you've gotten one of those OtterBox type cases, like the really rugged ones.
Yeah.
It's about that form factor. So to me, the way that the back edges are kind of angled in, it doesn't feel. In the hand, it feels like pretty solid, because it actually feels substantial. It's not a problem. The only problem I've had, it's not really a problem. It's just because right now I'm also carrying my old phone too. So I'm carrying two phones. If you have them both in the same pocket, it starts to be a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. Just because, like I said, we're still in the early phases of a lot of the software. So I went ahead and switched my SIM over. My regular SIM over to it. So I'm, receiving phone calls and SMSs on it instead of my regular phone or my old Android phone. But I'm still carrying around the other one and making a list of, basically keeping track of all the little daily driver things that I would need on this phone before I switch over to it 100%. And
that's interesting.
Yeah, what's crazy is I've had it for a week now, and there's already been all of these dramatic, like the team, I tell you, the team is just incredible. But every couple of days, there seems like there's this new update that shows up, and then you apply it, and then things get dramatically better. There's some huge bug that was bothering me or something, and then it goes away every couple of days. So
that's encouraging. So, so our last podcast, we talked to Don Norman. We talked about, usability and design and whatnot. And we talked about features that nobody asked for, that a lot of the problems, for example, we talked about the Ring doorbell, which, we love to talk about here. but he pointed out, and he said, but these features that you complain about, it's probably because you don't need them and you don't ask for them. So I'm just wondering, how many of these things, like I've frankly never, as I've owned multiple cell phones over the years, I've never really cared about the thickness or maybe the weight to an extent, but not really. I've gotten excited about screen size or speed or something like that, but it's just not something that I gave a lot of thought to. It's something that the companies imposed on me, assumed that I wanted. And I think that's kind of an interesting conversation. It's, maybe these things don't matter that much. I would love to be able to replace my battery. That sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the things on my own list of things that I need aren't that kind of features, just more pretty basic kinds of stuff what's funny is pretty much everything, I wrote it all down because I kind of wanted to keep track of it. Mm-hmm. And I even published a ticket with it in there. But I was essentially able to find for just about everything I mentioned, there's already tickets filed for all the things that I was looking for and people working on them. So, yeah, I mean, one of the, for example, right, because we're picking off the shelf hardware, in many cases, or we're not picking off the shelf hardware, we designed this from scratch. In many cases, we're the ones that need to develop kernel drivers for things. So if you get an off the shelf, if you're porting Linux to one of these off the shelf devices, in many cases, someone's already written a driver for things. But in our case, in many cases, it didn't exist. And so there's still a lot of work where we're just optimizing and getting certain drivers to work well. And one of those is power management. So right now, there's still a lot of cases where the machine is just running full bore. It's not, we haven't really optimized a lot of it yet. We're still working on that. There's huge room for improvement on that front, just because, like I said, if you look at the machine idle, there's a lot of things where we're not even, like, imagine taking your laptop and turning up the brightness 100% and compiling something. It's not going to last as long, and the phone's essentially kind of doing that to a degree, just because we haven't gone through and enabled all of the power management features of all of the hardware yet.
Okay.
But
well, cool. I think that sounds really promising. I think it's really exciting. I'm glad somebody is out there thinking of these things.
Well, I'll tell you what it's kind of what I noticed. There's been this psychological difference in this last week that I wasn't expecting. Where when I got the phone, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to start trying to move my workflows over to it and start using it for things because I'm testing it internally. And what I realized was there was a lot of self-censorship I was doing on my Android phone. There were a lot of things I wasn't willing to do on that phone, or applications I wasn't willing to install because I knew of how much tracking was going on over there. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to feed more data into it, right? And so it was weird because I had to, when I was starting to use this phone, I noticed I already had those habits so ingrained that I was starting to apply that censorship to this phone. And then I realized, oh wait, no, I can just install a weather application. It's not going to be tracking my location for the rest of my life and selling it to somebody. Or, I can install a podcast application and not know that it's going to try to, slurp all of those feeds up and use it for some recommendation engine somewhere. So it was weird. It's taken a couple of days of me using it to actually shift my thinking around it because, like I said, I was censoring so much of my behavior, and I wasn't allowing myself to do a whole lot of things on my Android phone that it could do because I was concerned about that.
That is interesting. It's like you've been let out of a cage.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. I feel way freer than I did, 2 weeks ago. Because there's a lot of things now, like I said, I'm willing to do with this phone that I wasn't willing to do before, or only willing to do on my laptop, let's say.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see that. There's a lot that I won't, add to my phone, and sometimes things that I will, but I feel like really uncomfortable about it. Sometimes I'll do it anyway, or then I'll delete it later. Or, it's unpleasant to have to constantly have those thoughts, but I guess.
So I noticed when I was looking at it online, and I may have missed some more, the base model comes with 32 gigabits in it of storage. Does it come with larger amounts, or can you just stick your own in there, which I guess would be more ideal?
Yeah. So we have a micro SD slot. So there's just one base. We just have one storage size, and then we have a micro SD slot, which is weird because my last couple of phones didn't have one. I mean, you can still buy phones that have that, but it is more rare because it's better for the vendor to encourage you to buy whatever the largest built-in storage that you can, But yeah, so I bought this on my current phone where I used to like to carry around all of my music. The main way I listened to my music was on my phone. I would carry around, I had a micro SD card that had all of my music on it. And so I just had it with me whenever. I wasn't really a big fan of streaming. I like to buy albums, and I had a big collection and like to rip them and then put them on my devices. But recently I wasn't able to do that because I didn't have the space. Because even with all the space those took up, if you start taking pictures and taking videos and things on your phone, that can fill up really fast. But yeah, so this one has a micro SD card, and I was shocked at how cheap the storage is nowadays. I just looked at like, well, what can I get for about $25? And it's like you get a fast 128 gig micro SD card these days for $25.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. And I mean, they go up to 1 terabyte or something now, I think. But so I just bought one of those and slotted it and mounted it, and then threw all my music on it, which is weird. It's nice to have it all with me again.
I feel like Micro Center has them. I think you could probably get a lot more than that even for $25. I don't know. It's crazy how cheap it gets. Every time I look, I'm like, I can't believe I can have this. I'm living in the future.
Well, and there's so much potential with that. So for instance, something I've been wanting to do and that we're going to be working on with this phone is, because we have all of the aspects of the phone that make up your identity are potentially removable. And so what I mean by that is, the things that uniquely identify you on the phone, one, any of your personal data. So with a micro SD card, you could in theory have that be stored on the micro SD card or backed up there. The SIM card, which has like your phone number assigned to it and everything, the modem, which has a unique identifier, and then optionally in our case, we have a removable OpenPGP smart card. So that would have like personal secrets, like your GPG secrets on it. But all those are removable. So you could conceive. So something I want to build is the idea of having personas, because I've written guides for Linux Journal in the past about how to travel with your hardware, and discuss the concept of having burner devices that you bring because there's a risk of theft, but also because when you cross borders, people want to, because there's so much good information on your phone, in some cases you could be coerced to turn it over, right? Yeah. So what I like. My advice, if you ask a lot of people how to solve that, they will come up with all these crazy, like secret pins that when you type it in, your phone transforms into a rocket and flies into space, or more importantly, or it self-destructs, or it lights some thermite, or, there's all these crazy ideas that geeks like to dream about, because they like to think it's fun to think like you're a spy crossing a border. But the reality is, like, Customs and Border Patrol see, liars every day, people trying to smuggle drugs across the border, and your average person is a terrible liar compared to a professional lie detector. So even if you had some sort of secret pin that you entered that did all this stuff, they would see that you look suspicious when you're telling it to them. So to me, the best way to cross a border is to not hide anything. Is to be able to completely comply with requests and not lose any secret data that you don't want to lose. Yeah. And one way to do that is to have these identities all assigned to, like you could call it a persona. So you could say, I have my regular persona I use when I'm walking around, working and being in my house. And then I have a travel persona, which maybe it's a different cellular modem. Maybe it's a different micro SD card. Think of it like a different user on a Linux system, right, that has its own applications, its own files. It has just the access and programs I need to travel. I don't necessarily need everything when I'm traveling. And so when I travel, I can switch to that persona, which would back up, if it needs to, back up all of my other personas' data somewhere, restore this persona, and I go travel. If someone wants to scan my phone, I can hand it over, knowing that they're only going to be getting like my travel itinerary, and whatever, all my travel, like the ebooks I'm reading while I'm traveling. Then when I go home, I can restore it. Or even, once you cross a border, in theory, depending on how you can get access to your backups and restore them, you could even restore it when you cross the border to some other persona, if that's what you're concerned with. But yeah, I mean, there's all these, that's something that I'm going to be actively working toward building out in the next, 6 months to a year on this, because all of those things that would identify you individually are removable, and you can swap in something else.
So something that I immediately thought of as you're describing this is you don't have to pretend to be a spy to need to protect yourself when crossing a border. I mean, how many articles have we read recently about journalists being harassed at the border and their information compromised? So it seems to me that this is a pretty valuable feature for a lot of different people with a lot of different threat models. But I mean, you as people who have worked for a magazine recently, it seems pretty relevant to us, right? I mean,
or just any average person working at a high enough level at a company where they may have company secrets and are crossing into a border that might be known for copying company secrets and replicating them, right? Yeah. Anyone who's done that, you have to have some solution in place. What a lot of companies do now is they will give those corporate employees burner laptops with a VPN, and those burner laptops have no files on them. And then when they come back, they, in some cases, shred them and give them to charity or something in case there's malware on them. But yeah, I mean, it's a threat, not just for the super paranoid person who thinks that they want to be a spy or whatever, but your average person that just has, everyone has some data that's private, whether it's company secrets or journalist sources or just a nude picture of yourself or something. People have stuff that they don't want to get out. On that note.
Yeah, I love the concept of personas, though, and being able to compartmentalize. I mean, compartmentalization is, I think, it's something that you've talked about a lot with Linux Journal and elsewhere, about that as a method to protect yourself and your things. But on that note, I think we've covered it. We've been talking for a while. I want to make sure we don't lose the audience and take up too much of Kyle's time.
Well, I think this is a good discussion. Well, thanks for having me on.
It's a good one.
Yeah. So, any final parting wisdom for everybody?
Mine is that it's really early. It's still early after all this time, and we have a lot to work out.
It's true. I mean, the phone as a personal device is such a complicated topic. I mean, there are just so many places to go with that. So many things. I don't know. So many bases to cover, I guess. So. We'll have to do this. We'll have to do a few of them before we even make a dent in the conversation, probably.
Yeah.
But I'm excited that someone's working on it.
Well, and I'm happy to be on. However often you like to have me on, and we can talk about where things are progressing.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. Let's talk about those personas next.
All right. Yeah. Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Thank you.